Richard Arkless.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's an honour to follow the gentleman from City of London and Westminster, and just to say I have the utmost envy for his commute home on a Thursday evening. Perhaps he would like my 7-hour journey that I do regularly up and down. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting speech, and the contributions from both sides of the House today have been very informed and very enlightening. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to take up too much time, but there are some new clause amendments that I wish to touch on very briefly before I hand over to the other front benches. Firstly, new clause 2, 3, 14, 15 and 4, which are essentially about extending the principle of corporate economic crime, which has been discussed at length across both sides of the House today. The bill, as drafted, incorporates a failure to prevent economic crime, but only in relation to tax evasion, and has been mentioned. It would appear sensible, given the current climate and given public mood, that we extend this so that the liability reaches the tops of organisations. And I've mentioned this on the floor of the House before, but as a lawyer who had some in-house experience working for a large retail bank, I can tell you with the utmost certainty that sticking your head above the parapet and telling the bank that they're wrong is not the most conducive course of action for your career. I didn't fall foul of that particular pitfall, but I think I probably would have at some point in the future. I think the public would demand that corporate economic crime is extended beyond tax evasion. I think they would be surprised to learn that the bank would not be held liable for LIBOR rigging, for instance. Of course, those individuals were prosecuted under different laws, but there was no corporate criminal liability for the board of directors or for the banks themselves for what the public, I think, would expect them to be held liable for. I don't think the public would thank us for having a corporate economic offence that extends to tax evasion. It's tax evasion, for goodness sake. I think the public would expect that the company, the bank, the large organisation would be held criminally liable for something as obvious as tax evasion. So I think it's a great shame that we haven't grasped the metal in this bill, unless the Minister, of course, has got something miraculous to say when he gets to his feet. But I suspect that we're not going to have an extension of corporate economic crime, which I think is a real shame. Even if it were to come to pass, I still have issues, Madam Deputy Speaker, about some of the provisions within the failure to prevent model, in that if a bank can show that it had reasonable processes and protocols in those circumstances, then it is an absolute defence. There's also a defence in here that if in the circumstances it's deemed that the bank ought not to have any reasonable processes in place. And I can tell you from bitter first-hand experience, by suing and commencing litigation against banks, that in the 11th hour, miraculously, they will pull together volumes and volumes of training manuals, protocols and processes that seem completely absent when the crime or the alleged offence was being committed, that somehow miraculously appear in courtrooms to convince the judge that they've taken all of the processes necessary. So even if the failure to prevent was extended along the lines of the incorporated new clauses, call me a cynic, but I still think there's an opportunity for a bank to, put it in colloquial terms, wriggle out of that potential responsibility. Other new clauses, Madam Deputy Speaker, obviously new clause 6, which I don't have a great deal to add in relation to what's been said on both sides of the chamber. We will support new clause 6. We are pleased that the Crown dependencies are not part of new clause 6, given that I'm clearly an SNP MP. It's part of my political definition that I don't want this place to legislate on places or jurisdictions where it doesn't have authority, so we're clearly reluctant for that to happen. We understand there's more of a case for the British Virgin Islands, therefore we will, for the overseas territory, and we will support the amendment on that basis. But I think my honourable friend, the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, member for Bromley and Chislehurst, was absolutely right to make the distinction between, for example, Gibraltar and the overseas territory. And throughout this process, I've become quite puzzled as to why Gibraltar is actually considered an overseas territory and not a Crown dependency. I wonder if perhaps probably not the Minister's remit, but it's something that's occurred to me over the last few months. But I think, transparency is key. If this government's policy is transparency, and we all agree that transparency would facilitate a more fair banking and financial system, then there ought to be no good reasons why, at the end of the day, those jurisdictions have public registers the same as we have. But I would corroborate other members' views, but that is the clear direction of travel. The direction of travel is in that way, and whether or not it's the right thing to do to legislate, to compel jurisdictions that we perhaps don't have authority over to do something is another question. But on the basis of transparency, and I think it reflects the public mood, then we will support new clause 6. In relation to other new clauses, I mean, new clause 11, again, is one of those clauses that asks this government to go through a consultation process to persuade and cajole the Crown dependencies to adopt legislation which frankly ought to be determined by their own parliament in their own jurisdictions. New clause 6 is easier to deal with in the fact that it deals with transparency and things that we really want to get done, but new clause 11 seems to me to be a wish-wash of let's have a chat with them and let's see if we can persuade them to do anything, when really that ought to be up to them, as it ought to be up to the Scottish Parliament, as it ought to be up to the Welsh Parliament, or whatever jurisdiction holds those powers. So I would have constitutional jurisdictional problems with new clause 11, but again I accept the basis behind it. But what I think you will find is that the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies will be quite willing to have that conversation about the effectiveness of the registers as time goes on. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have tabled 3 new clauses that have been considered in this group. The first is in Scottish limited partnerships, and I really have got nothing to add to my honourable colleague from Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, who is no longer in his place because he has to go to the aforementioned second meeting of this rather popular committee that he mentioned. He articulated the case very well. It would be our intention, if I could catch the Minister's ear, it would be our intention to push new clause 10 to a vote this evening, but that will turn completely on what the Minister has to say when he comes to sum up. So no pressure. We look forward to what the Minister has to say, or we will without question push new clause 10 to a vote. New clause 19, Madam Deputy Speaker, for me gets to the real heart of the issue surrounding criminal finances, and that is what I would describe as a responsibility-shedding, banking, sales-driven culture that we have in the UK. Because the banks are the facilitators of criminal finance, and they facilitate all the wrongdoing in the financial system. The reason we had the crash in 2007 to 2008 is because the pendulum had completely swung from banks being professional organisations looking after the client's interests to being completely sales-driven, profit-seeking organisations. I think the pendulum has swung too far, and I think it's that swing of that pendulum that created the mess almost 10 years ago now, and I think unless we deal with that culture, then we won't be able to properly deal with the facilitating that big companies and banks can give to criminal financiers. And it's a shame again that opportunity hasn't been taken. And not long after I was elected to this place, I was quite dismayed to learn that the FCA had withdrew their promise to look into banking culture. I mean, why? It's the most obvious thing that should be done to try and clean up the financial system. The public would demand it. I think business efficacy would demand it. And I just cannot understand why either the FCA or the government wouldn't bring forward a review into the very thing, in my view, which has facilitated the crash and could, again, facilitate another crash if we're not too very careful. New clause 18, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about protection for whistleblowers, and it is one that we have tabled. Given what I understand about the culture of banks, and given that I know it's very, very difficult for employees in banks to put their head above the parapet, I think people who work in these organisations that have information that law enforcement agencies could use to address and pursue criminality should have protection. Quite simply, if you raise your head above the parapet in a bank and you tell world and sundry that that bank is about or has committed criminal acts or is facilitating criminal finance, your career is over, not only in that bank, but generally in the financial services sector. And I don't think the consequence for honesty and transparency should be for you to lose your job and your livelihood, and there should be some form of protection, and that is why we've tabled that particular amendment. Madam Deputy Speaker, that concludes my submissions on the new clauses that we have tabled, other than to say again, ad nauseam, that we support the principles of this bill. We don't think it goes far enough in certain sections, but we do applaud the direction of travel that this bill takes the UK economy in. We hope we can go further, and we hope that the provisions in this bill are not caught up in red tape and bureaucracy, and they actually work so we can get at the bad guys' money, so the rest of us who play by the rules can have a fair crack at the whip.
Rupal Haq.